Every now and then, there's a game that comes out that I just can't believe is real. The Resident Evil 4 Remake was one of those games for me. Throughout the entire time I was playing it, it just felt surreal. I had been very excited for this game. Capcom has been on an absolute roll with Resident Evil. I loved the Resident Evil 2 remake. In fact, prior to this game, I'd say that was the best remake I'd ever played. And I really enjoyed the Resident Evil 3 remake, even though it wasn't quite as good and let a lot of people down who loved the original. However, unlike those two remakes, for Resident Evil 4, I actually have played the original game. I even made a long video on it last year, and let me tell you, for a 2005 game, it still holds up incredibly well. I mean, just look at it. I can't believe that is an 18-year-old game. It's aged so well that it didn't need a remake, but my god, it deserved one, and I'm so happy this remake exists. I mean, I may sound dramatic here, but this was genuinely one of the best experiences I've had playing a new game in a long time. I was just giddy with excitement the entire time. Like I said, it's just one of those games that you cannot believe actually exists. Anyways, I have a lot to say about this game. There's just so much to unpack that it's hard to put into words, but suffice to say, this is easily the best remake I've ever played. So this remake was directed by the same folks who directed the Resident Evil 2 remake, which probably explains why it's so amazing. And remaking a classic like this, the definitive best Resident Evil game to many people, and the best game of all time to others, is a very daunting task. In fact, originally, the directors didn't want to remake Resident Evil 4 for that very reason. Why try to remake a masterpiece? Well, I'll tell you why. Because they're just gonna make it a masterpiece again. However, because Resident Evil 4 is so beloved, they took a different approach for remaking it when compared to their process for the RE2 remake. Rather than try to capture lightning in a bottle twice with the same game, they would instead try to remain as faithful to the original as possible and find little things they could change or improve upon. And I think in doing so, they ironically have captured lightning in a bottle once again. The design and pacing of the original game is just so good that they didn't need to change the general structure much at all. The length of the game is nearly identical, if not longer than the original. I believe this is the longest Resident Evil game to come out since 6, and there is never a dull moment. There aren't big stretches of cut content like in the previous two remakes, and everything that made Resident Evil 4 the classic it is remained intact. Whether that's Leon's over-the-top superhuman-like abilities, his cheesy one-liners, or the dramatic and over-the-top set pieces and fight sequences. I think a lot of people were rightfully worried that the remake would lose the charm and cheesiness of the original, but it is absolutely still there and it's fantastic.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Really, the biggest changes I noticed were the order of some events, of course the new gameplay changes, and some reworked scenes that gave better continuity with Resident Evil 2 and made the characters more fleshed out and understandable. The same general thing happens for the most part in the original, it's just the order and how you get there is a little different, and I think it was great. The changes actually kept me on my toes a bit because I didn't know what exactly to expect, even though I've played the original, and that was really interesting. I mean, what would be the point if it was the exact same game? Really, the only minor thing I was a little bit disappointed about was the merchant's voice. The original voice by Paul Mercier is so iconic and charming. The new voice is fine, and it sounds somewhat similar, but not quite as iconic as that original voice.
What are you buying?
Wish your enemies sweet dreams from afar, with a bullet straight through their heads.
To be honest though, the new voice grew on me as I played, and if that's my only little complaint with the changes they made, then that's how you know they did an incredible job remaking this game. By far, some of the best changes in this remake from the original have to do with the characters. And not just one character, that goes for pretty much all of them. I want to start by talking about Ashley though, because I think her character is so much better than the original version. First of all, my ears were very happy they didn't have to listen to this for 15 hours.
Leon! Don't just stand there! Help me! Where are you going, Leon?
Ashley in the remake is considerably less annoying, and she is way more likable, which is important because the entire plot of the game is about saving her after all. But in the original, that was a little annoying to do because of how she acted. She was a little bratty, stuck up, and a bit of a thorn in Leon and our sides. This Ashley understands that she's in a perilous situation here and needs to listen to Leon if she wants to get out alive. She was way more understanding and obedient, and most importantly, a lot more mature and kind than her original counterpart. I mean, look, does she freak out and scream sometimes or run off crying? Yes, but that is very realistic for the situation she is in, and rather than being a constant burden, she's actually good company. I love that Ashley and Leon have these small check-ins after an intense battle where they make sure the other is okay. Leon making sure she's okay makes sense obviously since this is his entire mission, but Ashley also checking in on Leon was very nice.
You sure you're okay?
Never been better.
Good.
Unlike the original Ashley who called you a pervert.
Oh, you pervert!
Ashley being far more likable and a more mature character actually makes us want to save her. Our motivations are far better aligned with Leon's, and there's even a few times where Ashley goes out of her way and puts herself at risk to help Leon. I also liked seeing her get more and more comfortable and confident as the game progresses, as she adapts to the situation and develops a bond with Leon. And thankfully, they removed one of the cringiest endings to a video game I've ever seen.
Someone overtime.
Sorry.
It's still pretty clear that Ashley has a little bit of a crush on Leon. I mean, who wouldn't if Leon showed up and did all of this to save them? But it's a lot more subtle and sweet and far less cringy. Another character I think they really did justice was Luis Serra. I really liked Luis in the original game, but they killed him off so early and he deserved far more screen time. They kept his fun, humorous personality, his obsession with smokes, although Leon didn't offer him gum this time.
I have only one very important question. You got a smoke?
Got gum.
How observant, senor. Now, say, you got a smoke? You know, those things will kill you.
But most importantly, we got to understand Luis far better as a character, and even fight alongside him in sections where you were alone in the original. You get to understand his background as a former Umbrella researcher, how he's helping Ada, and why he chooses to go out of his way to save Leon and Ashley. You just got to connect with him far more, and his death, while way different from the original, was so much more impactful, having Krauser to be the one to kill him instead. I was really sad about Luis's death in the remake. Part of me was hoping he somehow wouldn't die in the remake, but they 100% did his character justice. And not only that, but it made me hate Krauser and want to avenge Luis. And it really hits harder on the fact that Leon and Ashley wouldn't have survived and made it out if not for Luis. It's also nice that Leon learned how to pronounce his name correctly.
Louis!
Said his name is Luis Serra.
But of course, even the main man himself, Leon, had some great changes. I really appreciate that this Leon feels more in line with who he is in Resident Evil 2. Yes, he's matured quite a bit and he's now a special agent badass, but it still feels like the same character. It's much easier to follow what Leon had been up to in the 6 years since Raccoon City and how he's changed. Again, just better continuity and tie-ins to Resident Evil 2. Of course, like I mentioned before, he still has those fun one-liners and dad jokes from the original, but there's a more serious undertone to the character that I didn't sense as much in the original. There's a little more below the surface to Leon in the remake, with being forced to work for the government and his trauma from Raccoon City and everything that's happened in the 6 years since. He's still the same dumb, lovable character he's always been, but you can tell something about him is different. He's not just the completely naive rookie cop anymore, and while that is was well shown in the original, I think it's even more solidified and apparent here in the remake. One of the best examples of this is with his interactions and battles with Krauser. Again, another character that got more fleshed out, an intriguing backstory and motivation for what made him snap, and finding out he was essentially Leon's mentor. In the original, he just calls Leon comrade, and that's the only understanding we get of their dynamic, but finding out it was more mentor and apprentice makes the fights and scenes between them that much more intriguing. I love that they gave him more backstory with this secret mission that went wrong a few years back, and Krauser's whole squad was killed and betrayed by their own government. It explains his motives a bit more, and it brings a much heavier emotional weight to their battle. And that leads into my opinion, the best scene in the game.
Do what you have to do. That's right. I trained well. Leon. That you did, Major. That you did.
My goodness, what a scene. The music, the cinematography, the symbolism with Leon looking at himself in the knife's reflection. If there was ever a signifying moment that shows the shift in Leon, it's here. Everything in this scene makes you think, oh, Leon isn't gonna do it. He's the hero. I mean, we've seen this kind of dilemma so much across so many mediums, where the hero spares the morally twisted villain, but he does it. And then quite literally, the door to Krauser's body, the door to Leon's past, closes behind him. What a fantastic scene and a dramatic improvement over Krauser's death in the original, in my opinion. I also particularly like that this comes not too long after a scene with Ada, where Leon claims he's changed since what happened after Raccoon City, where she tells him that he hasn't changed, he just thinks he has. And while an element of that is true, Leon still has a certain naivety and optimism to him. To me, this scene showed very well that he has changed. This is not the same guy from his first day on the police force. And I want to credit the voice actor here for a second, because he did an incredible job representing Leon's development and maturity over the past 6 years. He's the same voice actor who voiced him in the RE2 remake, and you can hear a clear change in his voice in RE4.
Hey, you can't keep walking away from me. I don't even know your name. I'm Leon Kennedy.
Well, after 6 years, that is one hell of a greeting, Ada.
You can just tell the difference by the pitch and inflection of his voice. I know they changed voice actors for the Resident Evil characters a lot in these games, but I'm glad they kept some consistency using the same voice for Leon. They did change Ada's voice, which I don't really understand why. Personally, I preferred her voice in the RE2 remake. I just felt it fit the character better, but it's not a huge deal. Ada is up to her usual antics, being all mysterious. However, I do really like that they added some scenes with her talking to Wesker, kind of brought some of what was in the original game's Separate Ways DLC into the main story here. It just gives more context with what Ada's actually up to and how Luis fits into all of it. And that post-credit scene with Wesker was really cool. It makes me think they're definitely going to do a Resident Evil 5 remake in the foreseeable future. But again, with Ada, her dynamic with Leon is always really fun to watch. And once again, I appreciate the continuity with Resident Evil 2 because in the original, it's not really brought up much. Leon doesn't have much of a reaction to seeing Ada for the first time in 6 years, so having the two talk about Raccoon City and catching up a little bit was a nice touch, even though Ada never gives a straight answer. And with that post-credit scene, we definitely see a little bit of a shift in Ada, and you can tell that in one way or another, Leon's influence is starting to change her. As for the actual villains of the game, mainly Mendez, Salazar, and of course Lord Sadler, there's not too much difference. To be fair, in the original, they weren't these super in-depth villains with complex motives or goals. Salazar and Sadler's designs are quite different, but I like the new designs. In the original, Salazar looked more like a little kid than an actual old man, and he was way more obnoxious. Again, the villains were never anything crazy, but I do like the added lore of the Las Plagas, how it works, how Sadler controls his underlings, and how you can see the progression of the parasites in Leon and Ashley throughout the game. There's some really intense scenes with that. But like I said, overall this remake just brought more. It fleshed out so many of its characters, a lot of which felt a little one-dimensional before. It felt more consistent and connected with the RE2 remake, which I really appreciated, and it kept the cheesiness while also adding a layer of depth and seriousness that just made the story itself more intriguing in my opinion. And I think Ashley actually being a likable character really paid off in volumes. The gameplay in the newer Resident Evil games is always so much fun, and considering how great the gameplay was in the original Resident Evil 4, I had no doubt in my mind that this game was going to be a blast to play. The Resident Evil formula they've created over the past few years is so addicting and satisfying, and the new additions they made in the 4 remake were awesome. First of all, I absolutely love that they kept some of the classic mechanics from the original game, like Leon's roundhouse kick and all the original weapons with their feel and designs. The Red 9 was my favorite gun to use in the original game, and it was my favorite in the remake. I did the exact same thing, I got it all maxed out with an exclusive upgrade as well. Just so much fun, the progression, upgrading weapons, and buying or discovering new ones as you go. It's such a satisfying loop, but the things they added to the gameplay that weren't in any previous Resident Evil games worked so well, and now I can't imagine a Resident Evil game without being able to do a stealth takedown or parry an attack with my knife. I never thought that Resident Evil needed stealth mechanics, and who would have thought such a simple thing would make such a big difference. I loved using stealth in this game. It was satisfying, strategic, and just gives you another way to play. And yet, it's not so overbearing that it takes away from the gunplay or combat. No, there is still plenty of combat. Stealth doesn't take away from any of that, it just adds. And to balance this by having knife durability, where you can now repair and upgrade your knife at the merchant, is just genius. I want this in every Resident Evil game from now on. As for the core of the combat itself, it's exactly what made the original game so tense and thrilling. Resident Evil 4 is a very action-heavy game. I know there's always this constant war within the community with action versus horror. I love both, and what made Resident Evil 4 so intense and at times scary is just how many enemies are thrown at you. And it's the same, if not more, in the remake. It throws hordes of enemies at you, and it's intentionally very overwhelming and stressful. And that's what makes it so great. I felt like even the gunplay felt more weighty and powerful than the last couple games, and the sound design on the guns felt like a huge step up. They sound so good. They kept a lot of the enemy types true to the original, even adding new ones or improving on others. The first time I fought the remake's Garrador was terrifying. They were hard to deal with for me in the original as well, but man, they did such a fantastic job with the Garradors in the remake. Being able to crouch especially is useful. Probably my favorite enemy type in this remake. The design and concept of using sound to fight them is just so cool. Adding little environmental sound cues to lure or draw them towards you, just perfect. The Verdugo and the Regenerators are still horrifying. I just can't get over what a great job they did remaking this. The reworked boss fights were great, changing up the design and layouts of some of them. I especially liked how they reworked the Salazar boss. They even added these little blue notice quests, which are essentially side quests, and those were a lot of fun. Not only are they totally worth doing since you get spinels for them, which you can trade for all sorts of good stuff with the merchant, but they're fun little extra things to do that make you pay attention and engage with the environment more, like shooting the blue medallions, hunting down infected rats, or even fighting little mini bosses. It gives you a good incentive to backtrack to the areas you have been to and do a little more. It was a great addition and a clever way to include the blue medallions from the original game. Again, this is something I hope we can see more of in future RE games. And then finally, I think something a lot of people were worried about is how Ashley's AI would function. Since you do have to escort Ashley and keep her safe throughout large chunks of the game, which can be difficult when you're dealing with swarms of enemies. I know a lot of people didn't like her AI in the original, but when I played it, I actually thought it was quite good and ahead of its time. Sure, there were some annoyances here and there, and she did get taken a few times, but that was usually my fault. But I didn't think her AI was anywhere near as bad in the original as some people made it out to be, and it's of course even better here. It's a pretty similar system where you can have her stay close to you or spread out, and even have her hide in things during certain sections. Rather than having a health bar like the original, she'll just be incapacitated and can be killed, and of course kidnapped. Maybe it was annoying a few times, but really not that bad at all if you do a good job of commanding her, and it's cool that every once in a while she'll do something to help you out and try to be useful instead of screaming this.
Damn it! Ashley!
The part where you actually play as Ashley was a lot better too, and kind of the more horror-focused part of the game, with some creative ideas and puzzles. I remember the original section relied on QTEs a lot, so I much preferred this. Overall, everything gameplay-wise just feels incredible, and I'm not surprised in the least. I knew if anything, the gameplay would be so much fun, and it definitely delivered. Admittedly, there was something really cool and immersive in the original about aiming with the laser, but there's so many great additions and improvements across the board that it really doesn't matter. Plus, you can even use the laser on a few different weapons in the game, so there's that as well. They did a great job of capturing the feel of the gameplay while bringing it into the modern era. The original Resident Evil 4 is a phenomenally paced action game. It does such a great job of putting you into the heat of things from the very beginning. In fact, the opening village fight is probably the most iconic and memorable section of that game. That whole village area is the best part of the game, and the castle and the island, while still fun and shook things up, admittedly wasn't quite as good as that village. And I feel they did a really great job in the remake, making the castle and island better paced and more fun to explore. I did notice some sections in the castle and island were gone or very different. The general layout and order in which you go through the different rooms was different for a majority of it as well, but I loved the changes. They made these two areas far more enjoyable for me personally, and made huge improvements in the atmosphere. Of course, a lot of that is thanks to the RE engine, which just continues to look so good in every single game it's used in. Thank you, Resident Evil 7, for creating this phenomenal engine. The environments look so good, the atmosphere is completely enhanced. There were a lot more darker sections where you needed a flashlight, bringing some more horror elements than there were in the original. I love the shifts in time of day, starting the game in a more darker morning period as opposed to broad daylight really enhanced the atmosphere, and yet it still changes back to daylight in time for the village fight. You get to see what the evening looks like with some beautiful sunsets and different types of weather with lots of rain and thunderstorms and heavy wind. The atmosphere really benefited from the advancements in technology and all the different weather effects, and the game looks absolutely gorgeous. No surprise there. It was honestly a really trippy feeling seeing some of these classic locations in the remake, because your brain sort of recognizes it, but it looks completely different at the same time with all the insane extra detail and added atmosphere. It's so bizarre, but it's also really fun to just point out what you remember from the original. There was a lot of this while I was playing. Also, another small small thing, but I like that they kept the style of the original as well, with the different chapters and the look of the inventory. It's a minor thing, but it goes a long way. And seeing the amount of care and detail poured into this game's environments and atmosphere, it's apparent when the people working on the game are genuinely fans of what they are remaking. The Resident Evil 4 Remake is some of the most fun I've had with a new video game in a while. I love the changes they made from the original, and for all those worried that this would be some cheap cash grab remake with tons of cut content, you couldn't have been more wrong. Obviously, I don't know a ton about making video games, but I imagine this remake must have been a lot of work. It's almost double the length of Resident Evil Village. Capcom knew they needed to go all out for Resident Evil 4, being the fan favorite game and one of the most iconic survival horror games of all time, and they did just that. This is the perfect example of how you remake a classic. And really, not many companies out there are able to make these remakes like Capcom does. I hope we get these guys to do all the big Resident Evil remakes, because between this game and the Resident Evil 2 remake, they seem to know what they're doing. So Resident Evil's hot streak continues, and I can't wait to see the next remake, whether that's 5 or another game. I hope they keep making these. I mean, the RE4 remake has already sold more than 3 million copies in 2 days, so it seems to be worth it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you remake a classic.